First, there was
Lichdom Battle Mage.
then APB Reloaded. And after that, Life of Black Tiger. But friends, a new contender has entered the fray. Welcome to Ark Survival Evolved for Nintendo Switch. For just $50 US, this glorious game can be yours. Come visit a tropical island with luscious trees, beautiful beaches, dense forests, and snowy mountains. Okay, let's be honest here. Ark Survival Evolved has never worked well on consoles. This open world survival game drops frames if you look at it funny. It isn't well optimized, and it has never run well even on the most powerful consoles. So when it was announced that this thing would be arriving on Switch, we were surprised to say the least. While Unreal Engine 4 has proven itself on the Switch, Ark itself has failed to prove that it can run well on a console, so why even bother looking at this game then? Well, I've always enjoyed seeing games ported to hardware well beyond the capabilities of the original. It's the reason why I enjoy ports like Contra 3 for the Game Boy, and Resident Evil 2 for Nintendo 64. And with the Switch, studios like Panic Button have successfully managed to convert games like Doom, Wolfenstein 2, and Warframe while retaining most of what makes those games great. The challenge with Ark, however, is clear. While games like Doom already run at 60 frames per second on PS4 and Xbox One, Ark runs extremely poorly on those systems, and it doesn't look especially nice either. So how do you translate such a poorly optimized game to something like the Switch? Well, it would seem that you slice up everything until it's barely recognizable. Okay, so the first and most obvious problem lies there, with the visual quality. Getting Ark to run on the Switch has required perhaps more sacrifices than any Switch port we've tested to date. Just to jog your memory, this is what it looks like on an Xbox One X. Yes, it's a much more powerful console, but you can see that while it's not a stunning game, it does at least create the illusion of a dense forest. There is some atmosphere here. Not so much on Switch. Most of the foliage is simply removed, leaving the forest completely devoid of detail. The jungle floor looks borderline unfinished, in fact. Distant LODs can no longer be considered distant, with trees and other objects popping into view just before the player. Right up until they fully draw in, you're left with these low-resolution billboards. It's almost as if you're stuck walking through the most distant LOD levels at all times. Textures then are a complete wash. The assets themselves have been reduced in detail, but the extremely poor texture filtering leaves them looking blurry and non-distinct. I'm not exaggerating when I say this reminds me of a Nintendo 64 title. Textures are just a mess throughout, and with most of the foliage detail eliminated, you're going to see a lot of them. Shadows are reduced to formless blobs that look more like a Rorschach test than an actual shadow map. Shadows are usually one of the first things to be pared back in a port like this, and it makes a lot of sense as they can be quite demanding, but even knowing that, the results are even more poor than you might expect. It just looks glitchy. What's worse, the shadows are constantly changing based on your position, shifting the look and feel of each area at random. It's pretty ugly. Perhaps the most egregious issue, though, lies in the resolution, and the attempts to work around it. This game is so blurry and so low resolution that it's almost difficult to even understand what techniques are in use here. Resolutions around 360p and 432p appear to be very common in docked mode, though I suppose it can go higher in very select circumstances, but if you pause during motion, the whole screen sort of breaks apart and huge pixel edges become evident. In these instances, we've even counted as low as 304 by 170 resolution, which is lower than a Sega Mega Drive game, only much blurrier and uglier. Of course, it's possible that the internal resolution is higher than that, but the resulting image you get when examining a still shot from the game running is very, very low. This is the lowest resolution Switch game or any recent console game I think we've ever tested. To put this in perspective, the effective pixel count that you get while playing is worse than just about every game on PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, and the like. In fact, in some ways, I was actually reminded of Far Cry for the original Xbox, but honestly, that's a higher resolution and it looks better than Ark. It seems that the game might possibly be using Unreal's temporal upsampling feature to smooth out pixel edges, but the base resolution here is just too low, so you're left with this blurry mess of a game that is nearly impossible to parse. Jump over to handheld then, and the problem is exacerbated with pixel counts seemingly hanging below 216p regularly, with dips below that even. And since we're talking about portable mode, you may have also noticed that when playing in portable mode, the visual quality takes an even greater hit. Everything is pared back to the point where it's barely recognizable. It's just a mess of pixels and half-rendered objects. It's true that playing on the smaller screen does help hide some of this to a degree, but even there, it's still very noticeable. This is the first time I've played a Switch game where I could look at the screen itself and basically count the pixels. It's that bad. So the resolution issue is kind of a problem. With panic buttons ports, in the worst case scenario, you could dip as low as 360p, but it was really quite rare, and further patches have improved things. It doesn't happen enough to be a problem. With Ark though, it's much more around this most of the time, and sometimes even worse, which is the real issue here. Now of course, as a fan of retro gaming that plays a lot of 240p content, this low resolution doesn't need to be so terrible, but the problem here lies with the temporal component and the poor upscaling. When you combine the two, it's just a messy, nasty looking image. I'd almost prefer raw pixels without any anti-aliasing with more of a retro aesthetic, to be honest. Modern graphics simply do not work at resolutions this low. On top of this, other effects and buffers are low res too, of course, or worse. Ambient occlusion, for instance, is a patchy low-res mess that we'd almost be better off without. Same goes for screen space reflections, which again, with the low resolution, they wind up looking rather messy and distorted. It's just not worth it. When you compare the game directly to the Xbox One version, it may as well be a different game entirely. The Switch version looks like a poorly compressed JPEG version of an impressionist's painting. Honestly, while some effects such as motion blur are missing, I feel like they maybe haven't gone far enough, as the resolution just isn't where it needs to be, and perhaps it's the mobile version that holds the key. This version runs at a much higher resolution with smoother performance than the Switch game, yet it's clearly lacking many of the visual features present in the full console and PC version. I feel like this version would have been a better base to start from, as the art winds up looking more attractive as a result of the increased resolution. The Switch version suffers by trying to deliver the full experience. Now, looking at everything, this is pretty much a disaster in terms of visuals, but I feel for the programmers. Trying to transplant the full Ark experience to Switch was most likely very, very difficult, and the results are pretty much what you'd expect visually. But that doesn't mean there isn't some good news. You see, Ark doesn't actually run that bad. Well, okay, I should clarify. By the standards of most games, the frame rate isn't great, but if you remember how the game can run on a regular PS4 or Xbox One, the Switch version stacks up pretty well. Well, okay, it's still pretty bad, but they do seem to be using triple buffering this time to prevent hard locks to the refresh rate or screen tearing. If they had stuck with the same method of VSync, which is optional on Xbox, it would pretty much lock to 20 FPS most of the time. It is better than I expected though, I have to admit. It just putters along at 30 frames per second, with some inconsistencies on the frame time graph along with various gameplay hiccups. Now I'll admit it, I'm more interested in this game for its technical performance than the gameplay itself. I'm not a huge fan of these types of games, thus I can't really say how it'll hold up if you make progress and fill the screen with dinosaurs, but at least general exploration isn't too bad. So how about portable mode? Well, it's pretty much the same. There's still plenty of dips below 30 FPS and it generally feels kinda jerky in motion, but it doesn't usually sink too low. Well, outside of dips like this. Again, by normal standards, it's really not good, but by Ark standards, it's kind of a miracle that it runs this well at all. The fact is, if you're planning to play Ark on a console, you've probably already accepted that performance isn't going to be great. So in that sense, this is maybe better than you would have expected. But there is one other performance related problem worth mentioning: loading times. When you fire up the game, Ark can certainly take its sweet time, But how long does it really take? Well, to find out, let's see how much progress I can make in Contra 3 The Alien Wars while Ark loads on the Switch. Ready? Let's go. The Switch gets off to an okay start with some nice music playing in the background along with some visible loading bars, so it does feel like the game is underway. There's really nothing abnormal yet. Over on the Super NES, Contra 3 is of course humming along beautifully. This really is quite a good game, isn't it? Ark though, it's still loading. We're still in reasonable territory here though for an Unreal Engine 4 game. It does load a lot faster on Xbox, I should note, but hey. This is installed to a very fast SD card, by the way, rather than internal storage. I suppose internal storage may be ever so slightly faster, but it's usually pretty comparable. Now at some point, the music just kind of stops, and it feels like the game is frozen. The first time I played it, that's kind of what I thought, in fact. Now, of course, while we're sitting here waiting on Ark, I've jumped into this tank here and I'm just blasting through the city. This is always a fun little part, although it can be tricky if you're playing as the second player. But unfortunately, Ark is still loading. It's stuck on streaming assets and the little indicators are moving there. What's interesting though is that I have found that it can speed up slightly in some instances. Maybe if you return to the main menu and reload, that can improve things. But every time I've cold booted the game on both of my Switch consoles, and it's installed to the internal memory card on the portable unit, the load times have been very, very, very long, just like this. I guess now we should probably start taking bets after I finish that first boss there. Can we make it to the second boss of this stage before the loading is over? Alright everyone, place your bets. So, yes, there's not a lot more to say about the Ark loading screen, but I sure do like the way that plane flies in on Contra. That's a cool scaling effect. And then they sort of use the color math feature of the Super NES to handle, well, that and the fire, which is why the fire disappears for a second. Notice how this has kind of turned into like a mini little retro discussion? That's kind of all I feel like doing when I'm sitting here watching Ark load. Contra 3 is just one of many examples of things you could do while you're waiting for Ark to load. I enjoy playing this game, but you could play other games, or you could go make a sandwich, as they always say, or do just about anything else, because, well, we're still loading. We're just passing 2.5 minutes here, coming up on the final boss of the stage. So, will we make it? We're right there. He's just about to come out of the wall there, but Ark isn't finished yet. It's almost done. Come on, Ark, you can do it, buddy. Oh, there it is. Perfect. So I think we have a solution then. I believe Namco's patent on minigames during loading screens expired a few years back, so perhaps this is the way forward. If the developers can implement an emulator into its loading screens, it could help alleviate these issues completely. I was able to play through nearly the first full stage of Contra 3 before the game could finish loading, but there's plenty of other games that could work as well. And I'm kind of half serious about this, by the way. But really, that's basically the big picture. Ark Survival Evolved on the Switch is an interesting port. The low pixel count, massively downgraded visuals, and rather low frame rate do subtract greatly from the experience, and it's not a great version of the game, but it's still kinda better than I expected. I still think they may have been better off trying to bring the phone version to the Switch, or making wider changes to the game to better fit the platform, because as it is, it's just not good enough. But again, I suspect we're not the target audience here, and those that are really into Ark already know that it has performance problems and will probably enjoy it anyway. Sorry Ark fans, this one is not for me. Well, okay, let me be completely fair here. The soundtrack to this game is quite good. In fact, that is far and away the best thing about Ark that I've found. The music was composed by Gareth Coker, who also composed for Ori and the Blind Forest. This aspect of the game genuinely surprised me, and honestly, I think it's worth listening to the soundtrack outside of the game. It's really good stuff. That's about it for this video though. If you did manage to find some enjoyment in this one, Do be sure to like, subscribe, click the notification bell up there, and follow us on Twitter because, hey, you should be able to do all of that well before Ark finishes loading. So, until next time,